human misery that is avoided because of that work. And it was led and created by Rosalind and Jimmy, and it's an amazing institution. They're also working on peace. They got very involved in the American elections this year, and it's going to be a wonderful, and it has been, and always has been, because it's so wonderful that the world and the American people have seen the Carters operate for 43 years since he was president, and they've got to know him pretty well. And they learned his principles, his integrity, his honor, his belief in human rights, and his belief in justice. And I do think, I'm a firm believer that the long lens of history, that ratification of what he is, it means a lot to how people will ultimately and are today interpreting his presidency.
It's an excellent point, Terry and Adamson. Thank you. Douglas?
Well, it is an excellent point. And, you know, we talk about Jimmy Carter as a farmer, but there's a novelist, Wallace Stegner, wrote a book talked about the geography of hope. There's no disassociating Jimmy Carter from Georgia. It wasn't just, I'm a farmer. It was about scientific farming. He learned about soil conservation. He learned about tree planting. He learned he created his own pond and its stock. I mean, he really was incredible at that. And just down the road, Georgia had an agricultural way station where he learned scientific farming principles. And then the Carter Center hired Dr. Norman Borlaug, the Nobel Prize winner of the Green Revolution. And Carter and Borlaug went all over the world trying to find ways to create new hybrid corn so a windstorm or a typhoon didn't kill your crops, so people would have food year-round. Carter did a lot of that. It wasn't just eradication of guinea worm or river blindness. It was how to do sustainable agriculture on a global way. What is a bigger issue than that? Creating food for countries in need.
Incredible. I want to go now to the east front of the United States Capitol, where we saw the flag at half-staff and this military procession. That's where our CBS's Nicole Killian is. The casket will be arriving shortly. Nicole?
Well, Nora, we have just seen the advanced motorcade arrive along with a special honor guard, and you can probably see some of that procession behind me. Any minute now, we expect to see the casket of President Jimmy Carter arrive by that horse-drawn carriage or military caisson. And what was remarkable about his journey from the U.S. Navy Memorial here to the Capitol is that that route mirrored his inaugural parade route back in 1977, where he was the very first president to step out and walk along that inaugural parade route. I spent some time at the Carter Presidential Library and Museum with the director, Meredith Evans, who talked about him being a trailblazer for doing that. I do want to pause very briefly as we watch this procession here.
at ease. Ceremonial at ease.
Washington's last trip to Washington, D.C. Former President of the United States.
For the attention.
This incredible and solemn procession that we are watching right now as America pays tribute to former presidents when they pass, and just thinking about what an extraordinary month it's going to be here in Washington. As this is the east front of the Capitol. On the west front of the Capitol later this month, a new president will be inaugurated.
And right now we can see the Russell Senate Office Building, that beige building behind the procession, where so many senators watched Carter take the presidency in 1977, wondered what he was going to be all about. They're now passing by the steps of the United States Senate, walking towards the House of Representatives, and of course toward the rotunda, where thousands of Americans will pay their respects in the coming day.
Our Nicole Killian is right there witnessing all of this. Nicole?
Yes, it's quite a sight to see, Nora, as we watch this horse-drawn caisson move to the center of the East Front, at which point it will stop, and we will see ceremonial troops present their arms and render honors to the 39th president, at which point we will see his casket transported up the stairs of the U.S. Capitol towards the rotunda, where he will be joined by members of his family. But also, interestingly, he will be joined by surviving members of his cabinet. There aren't that many left. Several of them are in their 90s, but we expect the former Treasury Secretary, the Honorable Michael Blumenthal, to be here, the Honorable Joseph Califano, former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and the Honorable Ray Marshall, former Secretary of Labor, along with the widows of several former secretaries as well. So they will join the family members at the top of the stairs there, all of them here in attendance for a ceremony that will take place inside of the Capitol Rotunda. We expect to hear from Senate Majority Leader John Thune, House Speaker Mike Johnson, as well as Vice President Kamala Harris, all of whom are expected to deliver eulogies and lay wreaths in honor of the 39th president. I think it's also important to point out just how rare these ceremonies are here in the U.S. Capitol. This is really an honor reserved for some of the most distinguished Americans in the history of our country. The last U.S. president to lie in state here at the U.S. Capitol was former President George H.W. Bush back in 2018. And I remember covering that, and many people from all walks of life, all political stripes, came out during that period to pay their respects. We expect the same to happen again once President Carter lies in state here at the U.S. Capitol, where following today's ceremony, members of the public will also get a chance to pay tribute. But important to note that this isn't just an honor reserved for presidents, but ordinary Americans as well. Those who have served our country in such a tremendous way. And today we honor the 39th President, Jimmy Carter.
Nicole Killian, thank you. And you may have caught a glimpse of the snow still on the ground here in our nation's capital following a late snowstorm on Sunday night as kids are out of school here in the nation's capital. Many of the federal offices are closed, and it's bitterly cold outside, quiet inside the rotunda as they wait to pay tribute. This is Jimmy Carter's family. He is survived by 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and 14 great-grandchildren attending these services today. Inside the Capitol are members of Congress, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Cabinet, the Joint Chiefs, all the leaders and lawmakers from both the House and Senate, all congregating to pay tribute to the former president and hear the remarks that Nicole just laid out that some of the leaders, and including the vice president, will make shortly. We're also told that we're going to hear shortly from the U.S. Naval Academy Glee Club. They are going to sing My Country 'Tis of Thee and Eternal Father, Strong to Save. That is the Navy hymn. And there will be an invocation from the chaplain of the U.S. Senate, Barry Black, and a benediction from the chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives, Margaret Kibben. Douglas Brinkley is with us, the noted presidential historian and longtime friend of the Carters. You spent so much time with their family. And how did they view this moment, or how have they viewed kind of these final years of the Carters' lives?
With great pride because of what the Carter Center's done, and they've got to travel with him. And there's another side beyond the Carter Center, which was his love of the land and the outdoor world. I mean, one cabinet person that he was very close to is Secretary of Interior Cecil Andrus, who gets very high marks. He's gone now, but Carter was very close to him. And but Carter didn't really, and he loved William O. Douglas, the former Supreme Court Justice, because of his conservation work. Jimmy Carter is a land conservationist in a big way, and the family shares that. They have special times, not staying in planes, but their other home in the Georgia mountains, where you can be in the woods and feel, the Appalachian Mountains, where I think Terry's at right now. It's just beautiful there. And the thought that he allowed them all to participate. Who doesn't want to save lives? Who doesn't want to go eradicate diseases? And all of them have pitched in many, many different ways. And remember, he should have won the Nobel Prize for Camp David, but he didn't get it till his ex-presidency. Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin won it. Carter would have been a Nobel-winning foreign policy president if not for a kind of a snafu by the Nobel Committee. But today we're honoring not just President Carter, but a global humanitarian and a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
And Bob, you can talk about that relationship with Jimmy Carter and Anwar Sadat, because you were there, right, when Jimmy Carter had that meeting, that early meeting. Barbara Walters was there, and he went on that secret trip to see, or you didn't, it wasn't secret, but it wasn't known about at the time.
Well, not until President Carter and Mrs. Carter were at a state dinner in Tehran while the Shah was still on the throne, and after they had dancing. And Barbara Walters and I, she worked for ABC and I for CBS, we were standing on the dance floor watching them dance, and I said, Barbara, why don't we dance over there and wish them Happy New Year? Because it was New Year's back in the United States.
And what year was this?
Well,
Early in the presidency.
Yeah, it was early in the presidency. So anyway, we walked out there, wished him happy birthday, and Happy New Year. And at that time, there was a rumor going around that he was going to make a side trip to Egypt to talk with Anwar Sadat. And this was beginning of the talks on that led to the Camp David Accords. And one of us, I don't know if it was me or if it was Barbara, probably Barbara, we said, Mr. President, we've heard this rumor that you might be going to Egypt. Is there anything to that? And he said, well, yes, we haven't told all the staff yet, but we're definitely going to do it. Well, I wanted to tell you, Barbara and I nearly broke each other's legs getting off the dance floor and to call. It was the lead story on the CBS Evening News that night. And I must say, if I were to list 10 of the most fun things I ever did in all my days as a reporter, that would be right up toward the top of the list.
It's a great story about the personal relationship that he was courting that led to this incredible diplomatic breakthrough.
And he obviously kind of wanted to tell somebody about it. And we just happened to be the ones who were standing there when he did. But people talk about how he was always closed-mouthed and all of that. When he wanted to tell you something, he sometimes did. Mm-hmm.
And CBS News played a part of the Camp David early on in an unusual way. Walter Cronkite had an interview with Sadat and said that Sadat said, yes, I will go to Jerusalem. And, then they did the split screen, and they suddenly, actually, the Camp David peace process began at CBS News in some ways. I'm exaggerating slightly, but you know what I'm saying. That with Bob and Cronkite back in there.
It was an amazing time, but I must say I think of it often, and I'm still not sure I believe it, but I said it, so it must be true.
I want to bring in Terry Adamson, who is a close friend of the Carters and their former personal attorney. And Terry, as we reflect in these moments too about some of the accomplishments of Jimmy Carter, did he believe that his presidency had been judged fairly?
The fact is, Nora, he didn't think about it very much. He didn't talk about it very much, and I don't believe he was worried about it. I think he felt like he had done his best. He felt proud of his accomplishments. He knew his difficulties. He lost the election kind of badly. But he thought time would take its course. He was still a young man when he stopped being president. He was 56 years old. And he lived for 43 years. And that's pretty amazing. And he accomplished a lot. And as I made the point earlier in your broadcast, the light of history looks at him and knowing him pretty well. They watched him a long time after he was president. And it really is part of his intangible legacy is the fact that people know that he's a man of conviction and fairness and judgment and human rights and service. The tangible part, of course, I said was the Carter Center. And I'm reflecting, you mentioned earlier that you're going through 3 former cabinet members, Califano, Blumenthal, and Ray Marshall, present, who are still living. And it just brought to mind very sharply the fact that when you live to be 100 years, you leave a lot of people behind. It didn't last that long. And there's so many people that are so important to Jimmy Carter, his friends and his political allies and others who are gone. And you get on like Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell, Walter Mondale, probably the most important role of a vice president in modern history. Griffin Bell and Cyrus Vance, great people who contributed a lot, who must be very proud today from where they sit, to watch the man they served and worked with and helped make successful and helped form his values, be given tributes by his country as he passes away.
Terry Adamson, thank you. And Douglas, as Terry mentions the fact that Jimmy Carter lived to 100 years old, I mean, he beat cancer. I mean, melanoma even spreading to his brain and his lungs. What do you attribute that to? Was it his faith?
He learned, for starters, to eat healthy. He read all of what doctors recommend. He never would be 1 pound overweight. He
Really?
made sure, yes. And remember, he was a cross-country runner at the Naval Academy. He played tennis vigorously. Even here in Washington, he was would jog all the time. I mean, he was a fitness person and stayed in perfect shape. But he would go do whatever you're supposed to do. Get to the doctor, get checked, do all of the things we're all supposed to do. And Carter did it. But in the end, genetics plays a part in all of that. Many of Carter's family died of pancreatic cancer, including his mother. Brother Billy died of pancreatic cancer, sister Gloria, Ruth, all of pancreatic cancer. It's a little belt there in Sumter County, Georgia, maybe from agricultural dusting, but also genetics that created a cancer spike. From that was a strange time in the 50s of agriculture, because DDT was being used, and it later got banned by Richard Nixon, DDT, but the South was being sprayed with all sorts of things back then. And President Carter now looks at his farm. He did solar, and there's a new interest in organic and the like. And remember, the great African-American of Tuskegee, George Washington Carver, who was known as the Peanut Man. That's just over the border from Georgia there, that area there. George Washington Carver and Jimmy Carter, both synonymous with peanuts and as a crop. And who's still with us, who's very close to Jimmy Carter's Andrew Young, who was his ambassador to the United Nations, also from Georgia, Dr. King's closest of associates. And Carter worked with Andy Young with the International Airport in Atlanta, the Love of the Braves, baseball team, Ted Turner, CNN still with us. So there's kind of Carter in many ways as a triumph of the Georgia people, including he loved Ray Charles, with Georgia on my mind, but people that were, anybody that had association with Georgia, Carter was in.
I spent a lot of time with Andrew Young in the last couple of years, and hearing stories from Ambassador Young, you really get a sense of Carter's journey on civil rights and on race. He grows up with this mother, Miss Lillian, who instills in him a sense of equality with all people, including Black Americans who lived in Plains and in archery. But it took time for Carter to prove himself to people like Andrew Young, because when he runs for governor in 1966, he's defeated. Then he comes back and wins in 1970. But his 1970 campaign turned some people off in Georgia because of the way he talked about George Wallace, said it would be okay if Wallace came to give a speech at the state capitol in Atlanta. But it was after that inaugural address in 1971 and the way Carter staffed his administration with more Black Americans and women down in Georgia that he really began to affirm in a way, his relationship with the new South. And Andrew Young was at the forefront of that movement, ultimately makes Andrew Young his ambassador to the United Nations. But you saw in Carter, it was a journey. It wasn't just something that was guaranteed or taken for granted. He had to earn those relationships. And Andrew Young told me one time, he went to visit Carter at a restaurant, and he could just tell Carter's interactions with people of color. It showed his soul in a way that any policy could not. That it was seeing Jimmy Carter up close, you got a sense of the man.
Yeah, you have in Atlanta at the Carter Center the Nobel Prize medallion of Jimmy Carter and Martin Luther King Jr.'s down the road, but there's no photo of them. They never met. It would have been political suicide for Jimmy Carter in the 1960s to be seen with Martin Luther King Jr.
But he had his support.
Daddy King, after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in 1968, Martin Luther King Sr. endorsed Jimmy Carter, and that meant a lot. And because the moderate Republican, Rockefeller Republicans had put a lot of money into Georgia in the historic Black colleges, and now Martin and Daddy King making that shift. And a man named David Rabahan, who's passed, he was important with Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Dr. King, and gave Jimmy Carter, when he ran for governor, the plane to hopscotch around. So he was indirectly involved with it, but with a Jewish American, not a Black American, because race, this was Lester Maddox's Georgia back then.
Absolutely. And Lester Maddox, who had preceded him as governor, his trademark, he carried an axe handle around with him to drive away
He was
demonstrators, as
Lester
it were.
Maddox, he wouldn't serve black students at his restaurant, and he made that axe handle the symbol of his entire political career. That was Georgia, but so was Jimmy Carter.
And that inaugural you're talking about of governor, when he said the time to end racial segregation in the South is now, he did it with Lester Maddox in the backdrop right there.
Yeah.
And that was for the Maddox people. Oh my, this was heresy what Carter saying that on the Capitol of Georgia.
That's classic Jimmy Carter. He didn't care.
Exactly.
He was going to do it his way.
I asked Carter in 2018 how his religious beliefs brought him peace when he found out he had cancer, and this is what he said. How has your faith gotten you through your cancer?
You know, I was surprised when I found out that I had cancer in my liver and in my brain pretty extensively. I thought I had just 2 or 3 weeks to live. And I was remarkably at ease. And I didn't concentrate on praying that I would recover. I didn't even think much about that, but I just prayed and thanked God for the blessings that I had received in life, the loved ones that I've enjoyed and that sort of thing. And I was not nearly as fearful about death as I thought I would be. And so that taught me a lesson that I didn't know about myself.
I want to bring in John Dickerson. And John, many people know how Jimmy Carter taught Sunday school, but what do you know about his faith?
Well, there's a line that Catholics quote a lot from St. Francis, which is preach the gospel and sometimes use words. And the idea being that your life is the model of the gospel, not proselytizing. And when I think of his Sunday school, obviously he gave lessons about the scriptures, but those lessons don't mean anything if his life wasn't, shot through with trying to keep himself to the standards as he saw them in his faith. And even that Playboy interview, that famous Playboy interview, which was an attempt to, improve his standing with a certain part of the electorate, he got himself into trouble because he was trying to explain that scripture from Matthew about women and having adultery in your heart. And he was trying to say that even though he believed in that, he didn't look down on anybody who might have committed adultery, and that it called on him to be humble. So this is, and that at the time, as a political matter, it obviously caused him issues with people, in part because candidates didn't talk about their religion. Candidates talk about it all the time now. But Jimmy Carter, one of his firsts was to speak about his faith so openly. And all the way through his life, and that question you asked him, Nora, and his reaction to it, and at other times he said, I've had a gratifying existence. So that idea that you can be at ease in the face of eternity is an extraordinary human response to what is devastating news.
And how much about being a devout Baptist did he define evangelicalism in terms of a more progressive strain of it, away from conservative evangelicalism?
Well, I think conservative evangelicalism of the kind we know now, that Ronald Reagan first turned into a political force, and then that has been a central part of the Republican Party now, is different than the kind of personal faith that Jimmy Carter exemplified, and that helped him politically. I mean, other Baptists and other deeply religious people recognized their faith in him, but it wasn't the political bloc of the kind you're talking about that really was mobilized later, starting in Reagan and moving on. So that would be the difference. But obviously, also, there's nobody from the modern Southern Baptist Convention is going to be doing an interview with Playboy magazine.
One of the great what-ifs of American political history is if the evangelical Christian movement that really started to rise to prominence in the 1970s, and Jimmy Carter was a member of in spirit and as a leader, if that had moved toward the Democratic Party. President Reagan of course, brings the evangelical Christian community very much into his political coalition during the 1980s, in part due to the Democrats' position on abortion rights, supporting abortion rights that galvanized a more conservative audience. But there was a brief moment in time where Jimmy Carter symbolized that evangelical Christians could be a part of the Democratic Party at the highest levels. And many evangelical Christians to this day really see Carter's presidency as a turning point, a last moment where that whole movement in this country really had at the highest ranks of this country before it moved to the right, where it has, for the most part, stayed politically till this day.
And he became very close, Jimmy Carter, to Reverend Billy Graham, and would go to the Graham Crusades. And he was deeply engaged with the Southern Baptist Convention, but it got more and more conservative, the Southern Baptist Convention. Carter stayed in it, but he became a progressive wing of it. And eventually they were driving Carter out of the Southern Progressive Convention at the end of his life, the last decades. But his love of the Baptist church is deep. Rosalind with the Methodist Church also, but the Baptist president he admired was Harry Truman, who was really his favorite president.
Jason Carter.
Yeah, we see Jason Carter and members of the family there on the steps of the east front of the Capitol as they are set with the honorary pallbearers have positioned at the base of the Capitol steps. Let's listen in.
Attention! step. Ready, 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 step. Forward, march.
And there you can see the beautiful east front of the United States Capitol. As the sun is setting here in our nation's capital, Jimmy Carter returns there to be memorialized by lawmakers and the Vice President of the United States. And as we watched this incredible procession, we were reminded by Robert Costa, following his curiosity, asking when was the last time a president gave an inaugural address from the East Front. And we learned
that President Carter did deliver that inaugural address as his casket was being brought up to the rotunda. There's Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh, Kagan, Chief Justice Roberts. We saw former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, whose family was an important force back in 1976. Though, as she has often said, her family was for Jerry Brown in that race, but ultimately became a friend, of course, of President Carter. So many top Democrats did.
And as the family makes its way into the rotunda for the remarks, there are members of the cabinet there as well. The Defense Secretary is there, Lloyd Austin, and some of the most notable guests, Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, some of our newest senators as well there, the mayor of Washington, D.C. The rotunda sits in between, as many visitors in Washington will know and familiar with the U.S. Capitol, in between the House and the Senate. And I imagine there will be a number of members from the Carter Center who will be inside the rotunda and at the Washington National Cathedral on Thursday for that state funeral. Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Amy Klobuchar, Senator Susan Collins. I could go on, Senator Tom Tillis, Ted Cruz, Jeanne Shaheen. I'm just pointing out the front row in many ways, all of them. Senator Jack Reed, the longtime chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. John Ossoff from one of the younger senators there, the two senators from Georgia there in the front row as well. Just about everybody packed inside. Senator Warnock, a minister himself, as well as members of the House of Representatives.
And if you see that raised box in the center of the rotunda there, it really has a connection, a deep connection to American history. It's the same, they call it a catafalque, where President Abraham Lincoln lied in 1865 following his assassination attempt. And it's a special piece of American history to be connected to the presidency, one of the greats, and Abraham Lincoln, now to a great man in Jimmy Carter and the life he lived.
And there, the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, as well as the First Gentleman, Doug Emhoff, right next to the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson.
And of course, Jimmy Carter said he was hoping to stay alive to see Kamala Harris elected President of the United States. It's one of his last things to get to vote for her. Of course, that didn't come to fruition, but it tells you that he was politically engaged to the very end.
Voting by mail, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
Senate Majority Leader John Thune there in the center, from a small town just like President Carter, Murdo, South Dakota.
Mm. Next to him, his wife, and then Senator Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives. And then you can see, as was pointed out earlier, some of the members of the Supreme Court just behind the Vice President and her husband, as everyone turns to face the honor guard, honorary pallbearers. Those are the Joint Chiefs.
Let us pray. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arms have bound the restless waves, we thank you for the inspiration of a consequential and laudable life as we celebrate the legacy of James Earl Carter, Jr., the 39th President of the United States. We proclaim your generosity to this nation and world for giving us the gift of someone with the ethical congruence to be salt and light to his generation. Lord, he made the world more palatable. We thank you for his passion for integrity, his commitment to leave the world better than he found it, and his exemplary love for his precious Rosalind. Inspired by his great life, teach us to know you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly each day. We pray in your matchless name. Amen.
Madam Vice President, Mr. Speaker, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and other members of the Carter family, and distinguished guests. Today we gather to begin a final farewell to Jimmy Carter, Navy veteran, peanut farmer, Governor of Georgia, and President of the United States. Sunday school teacher, Nobel Prize winner, advocate for peace and human rights, and first and foremost, a faithful servant of his Creator and his fellow man. In a commencement speech he delivered at Liberty University back in 2018, President Carter told a story about going on a mission to Massachusetts back in his younger days under the auspices of the Southern Baptist Convention. During that trip, President Carter was impressed by the success of a fellow missionary in winning souls to Christ. And so as the mission was winding down, he asked him what made him so successful. He was a little embarrassed by my question, President Carter recalled, but then he finally said, I try to have two loves in my heart. One love is for God, and the other love I have in my heart is for the person who happens to be in front of me at any particular time. It was a statement, President Carter said, that he never forgot. And I think it's fair to say that it's also a statement he lived by. President Carter's term as president ended in 1981. And for the remainder of his life, the longest post-presidency of any American president ever, he focused on making the lives of his fellow men better. That meant things like the Carter Center, which, among other things, works for the eradication of disease in some of the poorest areas of the globe. And it meant things like his work with Habitat for Humanity to provide affordable housing for those in need. And when I say his work with Habitat for Humanity, I do mean his work. Jimmy Carter knew that his status as a former president could bring attention to good causes. It's why he encouraged Habitat to make use of his name and image. But simply lending his name, or maybe attending a gala or two, wasn't Jimmy Carter's style. He was here to get down in the weeds and the dirt And he did that literally on numerous habitat builds, including one back in 1994 in Eagle Butte in my home state of South Dakota. Well into his 90s, he could be found with his hard hat and tools on construction sites doing the practical work required to get families into homes. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And Jimmy Carter did his very best to live according to the calling of his Lord and Savior. Today, I join all Americans in mourning President Carter and remembering his example. But I rejoice in the thought that he, together with his beloved wife, Rosalind, is now before the face of his Father.
To the family, to Jack and Chip and Jeff and Amy, the entire Carter family, Vice President Harris, members of the Cabinet, Leader Thune, my colleagues in Congress, and my fellow citizens. We meet in this sacred hall of self-government to honor an extraordinary man, a man who modeled the virtues of service and citizenship, as well as any other American. Surrounding us are the statues of those who gave their time, their energy, and their lives for the good of America. Before us lays a man who now joins their midst as a patriot, a veteran, a humanitarian, and the 39th President of the United States. When Jimmy Carter walked out on the east front of the Capitol and took his oath of office, I was just 4 years old, and he's the first president that I remember. Looking back, it's obvious now to me as an adult why he captured everyone's attention. Jimmy Carter was a member of the greatest generation. He lived through the Great Depression. He did that on a farm in rural Georgia. He knew the value of a dollar, and he modeled thrift his entire life. As long as he was in office, he hated government waste. His father, an Army veteran of the World War I era, taught patriotism to his children. And eventually his son, this young man from Plains, followed his father's example of self-sacrifice, and he joined the Naval Academy in the middle of World War II. In the Army, Lieutenant Carter learned from the legendary Admiral Rickover to always do his best as he served on the first fleet of nuclear submarines. It's telling that today the USS Jimmy Carter, a top-secret attack submarine, now roams the oceans, bearing the name of the only president who served in such close quarters. President Carter's life, his selfless service, his fight against cancer, and his lasting contributions to his fellow man are all truly remarkable. Whether he was in the White House or in his post-presidential years, as was discussed, President Carter was willing to roll up his own sleeves to serve and get the job done. We all know about his work with Habitat for Humanity, and that was mentioned. And the origin story goes that it was in 1984, when he first became aware of the work. He was in New York for a friend's anniversary. Millard Fuller, the founder of the fledgling charity at the time, called President Carter and asked if he wanted to visit a site in Brooklyn during his trip. President Carter agreed, and he found his way down to the Lower East Side. Standing on the roof of a dilapidated building, he looked out on the wealth of Wall Street to the south and to the power of Midtown Manhattan to the north. And then he looked down, and he saw an image he'd never forget. An elderly woman cooking breakfast over an open fire in the rubble of the building, there in the heart of the richest city in the world. The Habitat for Humanity worker that was there with him turned to President Carter and said, if there's anything that you can do, we would take it. He said, if there's anything I can do, let me know. The worker said, well, maybe you can send some volunteer carpenters from your church. It was the very next day that President Carter called Habitat for Humanity and told them he was going to send some carpenters, all right, and that he himself would be one of them. And thus began his famous tradition of donating 1 week every year to build and restore homes for his fellow Americans. It's remarkable to think that one of the 45 men who has served as president and one of the only 13 who held the role in the nuclear age would humble himself to such service. We all know that his care for humanity didn't stop at building homes. In the face of illness, President Jimmy Carter brought life-saving medicine. In the face of conflict, he brokered peace. In the face of discrimination, he reminded us that we are all made in the image of God. And if you were to ask him why he did it all, he would likely point to his faith. I'm reminded of his admonition to, quote, live our lives as though Christ were coming this afternoon, and of his amazing personal reflection. Quote, if I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. We all agree that he certainly did. So today in these hallowed halls of our republic, we honor President Carter, his family, and his enduring legacy that he leaves, not only upon this nation, but upon the world.
Leader Thune, Speaker Johnson, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, members of Congress, and distinguished guests. It is an honor to be with you this afternoon, and to Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and Jason, and all the other members of the Carter family. On behalf of the American people, Doug and I offer our deepest condolences. Being with you today, I'm reminded of the enduring words of a favorite hymn. May the works I have done speak for me. Today we gather to celebrate the life of a man whose works will echo for generations to come. A man from Plains, Georgia, who grew up without electricity or running water, and served as the 39th President of the United States of America, and lived every day of his long life in service to the people. President James Earl Carter, Jr. So I was in middle school when Jimmy Carter was elected president, and I vividly recall how my mother admired him, how much she admired his strength of character, his honesty, his integrity, his work ethic and determination, his intelligence, and his generosity of spirit. We have heard much today and in recent days about President Carter's impact in the 4 decades after he left the White House. Rightly so. Jimmy Carter established a new model for what it means to be a former president, and leaves an extraordinary post-presidential legacy. From founding the Carter Center, which has helped advance global human rights and alleviate human suffering, to his public health work in Latin America and Africa, to his tireless advocacy for peace and democracy around the globe. And Jimmy Carter was the President of the United States who was ahead of his time. He was the first President of the United States to have a comprehensive energy policy, including providing some of the first federal support for clean energy. He also passed over a dozen major pieces of legislation regarding environmental protection, and more than doubled the size of America's national parks, including protecting our beloved redwoods in my home state of California. He was a president who, between the years of 1977 and 1981, appointed more Black Americans to the federal bench than all of his predecessors combined, and appointed 5 times as many women. And in the wake of Watergate, Jimmy Carter passed historic ethics legislation to help rebuild America's faith in government. Jimmy Carter, as president, was also a respected global leader. To be sure, the years of his presidency were not without international crises or challenges, but his legacy of global leadership is well established. In Asia, he instituted full diplomatic relations with China, which he would later call one of the most historically significant accomplishments of his presidency. And his legacy lives on in the Middle East because, do recall, in the decades before Jimmy Carter became president, Israel and Egypt had been at war numerous times. Few thought peace could be achieved between them. Yet Jimmy Carter did that. Through his persistence and perseverance, through his unshakable belief in the power of American diplomacy, he secured the Camp David Accords, one of the most significant and durable peace treaties since World War II. And throughout the world, Jimmy Carter elevated the role of human rights in America's foreign policy priorities and uplifted the importance of civil society in doing that work. Jimmy Carter was a forward-looking president with a vision for the future. Consider his establishment of the Department of Energy in 1977, which anticipated the central role it would play in addressing the climate crisis. His creation of FEMA in 1979, which enabled our nation to mobilize a national response to disasters, which has helped countless communities rebuild and recover. And his founding of the Department of Education later that year, which elevated public education institutions and increased national standards for the education of America's children and future leaders. Jimmy Carter was that all too rare example of a gifted man who also walks with humility, modesty, and grace. Recall the stories from the 1976 campaign about how he slept in the homes of his supporters to share a meal with them at their table and to listen to what was on their minds. How on their first trip for Habitat for Humanity, Jimmy and Rosalind rode the bus with the other volunteers. And when the group stopped for the night to stay at a local church, Jimmy and Rosalind gave their private room to a young couple who had put off their honeymoon to join the trip. And with the other volunteers, they then slept on the floor of the church basement. And then, of course, his work to eradicate the vicious guinea worm disease that once disabled millions of people a year. It was one of the Carter Center's greatest triumphs. And Jimmy Carter, of course, given his nature, attributed its success not to his own leadership, but to the thousands of everyday Africans who were on the ground doing the work. Throughout his life and career, Jimmy Carter retained a fundamental decency and humility. James Earl Carter Jr. loved our country. He lived his faith, he served the people, and he left the world better than he found it. And in the end, Jimmy Carter's work and those works speak for him, louder than any tribute we can offer. May his life be a lesson for the ages and a beacon for the future. May God bless President Jimmy Carter, and may God bless the United States of America.
My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my
And Our Country, 'Tis of Thee, a moving rendition by the U.S. Naval Academy Glee Club. Now you have the Democratic and Republican leader of the United States Senate delivering a wreath to the casket. A sign of tribute and of prayer and of honor of the 39th President, Jimmy Carter. This is one of those rare occasions in Washington, a bipartisan group come to honor a former president. Jimmy Carter will lie in state, the U.S. Rotunda, the U.S. Capitol, for the next 48 hours, starting at 7 o'clock tonight. Visitors, anyone, can go visit and pay their respects. Gathered at this hour, we have witnessed members of Congress from both houses, from the United States Senate, as well as the House. There are Supreme Court members there, from the cabinet. The entire Joint Chiefs is there. As the coffin of the late Jimmy Carter is on top of what is the Lincoln catafalque that was constructed in 1865 to support the casket of Abraham Lincoln while the president's body lay in state at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Now you can see the two leaders of the U.S. House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrat, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, the Republican there. In their tribute and paying respect to the former president. Today has been an elaborate final farewell for Jimmy Carter, who always didn't love the pomp and circumstance of the White House, who at one point had banned them playing Hail to the Chief, but today it was played many times when he arrived in Washington, the U.S. Navy Memorial, and also here in the U.S. Capitol. His final and third wreath, placed by the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, and her husband, Doug Emhoff. Thousands are expected to make a visit to the U.S. Capitol to honor the 39th president, who served in the White House from 1977 to 1981. Again, members of the public can visit starting tonight at 7 p.m. till midnight on Tuesday, and then all day Wednesday, the doors will be open for visitors. And then on Thursday, there will be a formal memorial, the U.S. National Cathedral here in Washington, where President Biden will speak and eulogize his friend, Jimmy Carter. The final farewell to President Jimmy Carter continues over the next several days. As mentioned, Carter will lie in state until Thursday, and then we will bring you his funeral at the Washington National Cathedral. That is live on Thursday. Later that day, President Carter will leave D.C. for one last time, heading home to Plains for a funeral there and private burial alongside former First Lady Rosalind Carter, his late wife of 77 years. Our coverage of the state funeral of Jimmy Carter will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and we'll have a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell.